A New York Times columnist named Bret Stephens today had a melodramatic hissy fit where he decided to announce to great fanfare that he was quitting Twitter. Now, if you participate on Twitter, as I do, probably to my detriment, but nonetheless, you'll know that for the duration of the time that Twitter's been around, there have always been people who would take it upon themselves to proclaim that they were leaving Twitter for whatever reason and try to make a big statement with it. I can remember this happening literally from the beginning. 2009 is when I joined, and it's been going on ever since. And usually the thing these people try to do is they blame the medium itself for their failures. So they point out that Twitter can be toxic and doesn't lend itself to fully articulated thoughts because of the space restriction. They bemoan how people will say mean things over Twitter that they might not say in real life, which is all true to some extent, but especially if you're a media professional, right? If you're somebody whose job it is to speak in public and you choose to use Twitter to disseminate your ideas, the idea that you're going to turn around and blame Twitter itself for when you beclown yourself is ridiculous. And yet it happens all the time. So Bret Stephens did it today, and he said, "Time to do what I long promised to do. Twitter is a sewer. It brings out the worst in humanity. I sincerely apologize for any part I played in making it worse and to anyone I've ever hurt. Thanks to all my followers, but I'm deactivating this account." Now, will he reactivate it at some point? Probably. Or maybe he's really going to stick by his guns and stay off. Most people who declare that they're leaving Twitter end up coming back on, or at least create like a secret alt account so they can't be detected, because like the way social media works, at least in my experience and on Twitter in particular, is it almost gets wired into your cognitive system in a way that is a little disturbing, frankly. So to cut yourself off from it, it's almost like a physiological dependency. And so unless you're like really willing to commit to the detox process, then there's a good chance you're going to come back for another hit, you know? And actually that says a lot about really the dark genius of the people who create these media, meaning the social media platforms, because they've gotten to something fundamental in the human psyche, which makes it so that even if people, disdain Twitter on some level, they keep going back for more, and it takes a special kind of person to shun that entirely. Maybe not special, but you have to have a certain amount of willpower. And, but that all said, there should be a way for a media professional to engage constructively with Twitter where he doesn't use it as a scapegoat to explain away his failures. I've said a stupid thing or a poorly phrased thing now and then on Twitter, and I don't blame the platform. I blame myself because I chose to engage on it. Therefore, it's on me if I didn't communicate something effectively. And you try to learn from it and move on. Right? But Bret Stephens, from his perch at the New York Times, decides to blame the medium itself. And what was the incident that led to this melodramatic disavowal? Well, he got called a, quote, bed bug. You heard that right. Somebody on the internet, on Twitter in particular, did a throwaway joke where they likened Bret Stephens to a bed bug. Because yesterday, apparently, there was an issue with some kind of bed bug infestation at the New York Times headquarters in Manhattan, and somebody cracked a joke that, Bret Stephens, who they don't like as a columnist, is the bed bug. Okay, big deal. I get called more vicious and just mind-bogglingly insulting things every single day on Twitter, and if I were to, totally alter my behavior, and disavow the medium on account of being insulted, I would have disavowed it like 9 years ago. So it's just a trade-off that one makes as a quasi-public figure in my case, that if you're going to engage in debate on contentious topics in public, you have to expect and even welcome on some level really incendiary responses which are intended to denigrate you as a person, and you can't take it too personally. Because if you do, you're going to be a basket case, which is what a lot of these people turn out being. So Bret Stephens decided to email the boss, essentially, of the guy who called him a bedbug. Guy happened to be a professor of some kind at George Washington University, and Bret Stephens complained to the provost and apparently has insufficient self-awareness to know that that was obviously going to boomerang on him and make him look terrible, especially with as trivial of an insult as that. I mean, come on. Complaining to the boss in that kind of circumstance when you're being just insulted is lame in any event, but for such a mild insult to provoke that kind of response makes Bret Stephens just look ridiculous. Ridiculously petty. And so, of course, it became a big firestorm on Twitter last night and this morning, and Bret Stephens responds by saying he's quitting Twitter. So he's basically trying to deflect the criticism of him onto the medium, which is basically just an open forum for anybody to partake in. And if you can't engage with it in a way that doesn't make you look like a complete clown, then that's on you, Bret. Sorry. I'm not sympathetic to media professionals who blame their self-defeating behavior on the medium through which they transmit their work. Sometimes the problem is just you. And then hilariously, Bret Stephens went on MSNBC this morning and said that he objected so strenuously to being called a bedbug because, quote, there's a bad history of being analogized to insects that goes back to a lot of totalitarian regimes in the past. So he is hilariously implying that if that insult was allowed to slide, it could be a slippery slope toward totalitarian rule, where New York Times columnists, I guess, are being mass exterminated or something. I mean, nobody takes that seriously. It's funny because you can't find like a single Bret Stephens defender anywhere across the political spectrum. It's just an incredibly petty overreaction to what is really just incredibly commonplace online, which is you get targeted with insults if you're in a position of media prominence, and even if you're not. I mean, being at the New York Times ought to insulate you from being excessively sensitive to that kind of reaction, but apparently for Bret Stephens it enhances his sensitivity, which is just a bizarre dynamic, and it leads you to wonder why media elites are so sensitive, why they are snowflakes. And in Bret Stephens' case, it's even more ironic because he routinely derides snowflake culture, so to say, which, there are legitimate criticisms there, but then for him to act like a special snowflake himself in response to some very light criticism, barely even criticism at all, kind of gets to the shallowness of his worldview. So, that's funny. And, if you ever wonder why media elites are so basically childlike in their inability to take criticism, probably because they're immersed in this sort of insular culture where they're constantly being reaffirmed as virtuous and wise by their colleagues. So when the rabble gets to weigh in and puncture their little confirmation bias bubble, they get very offended. And in Bret Stephens' case, to a hilarious extent, which caused him to melodramatically proclaim that he's leaving Twitter. Well, Maybe Twitter's the least of your problems, Bret. Okie doke. Talk to you later.